afternoon, sports fans, and welcome to today's lecture on the Panhellenic Games. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're getting in our chariot. We're leaving Olympia, and we're traveling around Greece to visit a series of sanctuaries and games that brought together athletes and citizens and religious devotees from across the Greek world. Now, in some ways, you're already familiar with this concept. I mean, it all started at Olympia with the Olympic Games for Zeus's sake. But today, we're going to see how this model was adopted, or at least evolved, elsewhere in the Greek world. And as we go through today's lecture, I want you to think a little bit about the implications of sports outside of Olympia. What's the effect culturally and politically and economically and religiously of these games where all the Greeks come together? So, whether you're looking for a little advice from the Oracle of Delphi, or you just have a strange desire to fight the Nemean lion, journey with me as we investigate the Panhellenic Games. So let's start with the name. When we talk about the Panhellenic Games, we're very literally talking about the games where all Greeks came together. Pan means all, while Hellenic means Greek. So think of these as the all Greek games. Now there were 4 of these in antiquity, and each one was located at an important Panhellenic or all Greek religious sanctuary. We've got Olympia, Delphi, Isthmia, Nemea. Those are the 4 sites. Now, to understand the importance of the Panhellenic Games, you have to reflect on the cultural and political ecology of Greece in the ancient world. Now, today, Greece is a country in southern Europe, with territory extending north into the Balkans and east and west and south from the mainland into a myriad of islands. All this territory, however, is officially governed from Greece's capital, right? The city of Athens. So yeah, like Greece is a modern country with clear borders and a capital city. Maybe not the most exciting thing ever, but stick with me here. This is going somewhere. Now, in the ancient world, this was very much not the case. Take out your little brain eraser and first and foremost, erase all concepts of strict and clear national borders. Greece was not a country in any real modern sense of the word. And to some extent, it had a core centered on the Aegean Sea, right? That was kind of the core centered around the Aegean. And that region included mainland Greece and western modern-day Turkey and all the islands in between. But after centuries of colonization, Greek city-states spread far outside this core to areas like the Black Sea, and to southern Italy, and to Sicily, and to southern France, and to eastern Spain, and to North Africa. Greek city-states were all over the Mediterranean. And here's the kicker. All these city-states, they were all politically independent. So Athens was independent from Sparta, which was independent from Corinth, which was independent from Argos, and from Syracuse, and from Acragas, and from Thebes, and from Megara, right? All of these city-states are all politically independent, right? You get the idea. Now imagine a United States that, really wasn't so united. So for example, maybe it had no national or state level government, and every city got to govern itself completely differently, however it wanted to. Now, you might think of that as an awesome political idea, depending on your political leanings, but think of the chaos and the competition and the warfare that might arise between those cities. And so it was in ancient Greece. Greek city-states fought with each other just as much, and very honestly, probably much, much more, than they fought with any foreign invaders. So the logical question then is, if they're not politically united, what makes them all Greek? Why do we talk about ancient Greece as a collective whole when all these city-states are politically independent? Well, it's the shared aspects of culture that lead us, and led the ancient Greeks themselves, to view the Greeks as a coherent category. And this includes a shared language, a shared religion, and a shared set of cultural values. And one of those cultural values, of course, was the importance of sport and athletics. There we go. Now it's coming full circle. So now you can begin to see the importance of the Panhellenic sanctuaries and the Panhellenic Games. This tension between political independence and shared culture necessitated events and locations where Greeks from different city-states could come together peacefully to build their shared cultural bonds while avoiding divisive warfare. And that's exactly the function that both the Panhellenic Games and the Panhellenic sanctuaries of which they were a part were put together to host and perform. All right, now in our last lecture, we saw the earliest and greatest of the Panhellenic Games, the Olympic Games. And those were performed at the site of, yeah, you guessed it, Olympia. Duh. Anyway, they were in honor of the god Zeus. But today we're going to travel to the three other major Panhellenic religious sites and check out the games associated with those sites. And we'll begin today with the second most important set of games in ancient Greece, the Pythian Games at the site of Delphi. Now, you might say, hold up a second here, Dr. Rob, the Pythian Games? What are you thinking here? Why aren't they called the Delphic Games? Well, that's a great question. And like most ancient Greek myths, it all begins with Zeus looking for some action. This time, he's after the Titaness Leto. Now, they make out and she gets pregnant. And Hera, Zeus's wife, of course, is absolutely furious. And she sends a giant dragon snake monster, called the Python, to chase old pregnant Leto around. Hera curses her, and she prophesizes that she can't give birth anywhere on land. Now Leto runs and runs and runs and runs some more, and eventually makes her way to Delos, a sacred floating island. And on this floating island, she hangs from a tree and gives birth to twins, first to Artemis and then to Apollo. And then young Apollo turns the tables on the Python and he begins hunting it, chasing it throughout the Greek world, and eventually catching it and shooting it and killing it at the site of Delphi on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. Now the Python plummeted into a deep crevasse and noxious fumes escaped as it decayed. And above that crevasse, the temple of Apollo at Delphi was built, and the Ataton, the most sacred area of the temple, the Oracle of Delphi, known as the Pythia. In that Ataton, that's where she inhaled the fumes and delivered the ecstatic prophecies to some of the most powerful people in all of Greek antiquity. So there you go. That's why we call it the Pythian Games, named after the python that Apollo slew at the site of Delphi. Now, just like the Olympics, the Pythian Games took place every 4 years. Although this would have alternated with the Olympics, so they wouldn't have been in the same year, right? 2 years gap between the Olympic Games and the Pythian Games. And just like the Olympics, we can tell from the archaeological remains that the religious aspects of the site of Delphi started way earlier than the sporting events. So the religious aspects started sometime around 1000 BCE. The athletic competitions started centuries later. Now, unlike the Olympics, the contests at the Pythian Games began with music rather than athletics. The first recorded competition focused on playing the kithara, or the lyre, right? Strumming the instrument. And this is an instrument from which we derive our word for the guitar. Kithara, guitar. Kithara, guitar. You can kind of hear it. Anyway, the first athletic games were introduced in 586 BCE, and they were similar in nature to those of the Olympics. So various types of foot races and the pentathlon would have taken place in the stadion high above the Temple of Apollo on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, while the equestrian events, right, the horse racing and the chariot racing, and maybe the mule racing as well, took place down on the plains below the sanctuary. And just like the Olympics, the number and diversity of events increased over time, as hoplite racing and chariot racing and boys' age divisions were all added to these games as they progressed in Greek antiquity. Now, similarities with the Olympics exist as well when it comes to the prizes. The winners at the Pythian Games received a wreath of laurel, the tree sacred to the god Apollo, just like the winners at the Olympics received an olive wreath. This became a thing, and at all the Panhellenic Games, winners were awarded with wreaths rather than material wealth-based prizes. And as a result, they became known as the Panhellenic Games, based on the Greek word Stephanos, meaning wreath. Kinda like my last name, actually. Guess I have some Panhellenic glory somewhere along my ancestry. Next up, we've got the Isthmian Games, named for the site of Isthmia near the bustling city-state of Corinth. And as its name suggests, Isthmia was located on, that's right, an isthmus, a small piece of land that serves as a narrow bridge between two larger bodies of land. It comes from the Greek word for neck, actually, and just like the neck connects the head to the body, Isthmia and Corinth, they connected the Peloponnese, down where Sparta is, to Attica, up where Athens is. Two of the most important regions in Greece. And through these games, the widely prosperous city of Corinth was able to showcase its culture and wealth to the rest of the Greek world. Now, compared to Olympia and Delphi, there's not much to see in terms of the archaeological remains at the site. There would have been a temple to Poseidon, although very little remains of that, and there would have been at least two versions of stadia built at the site, although neither of those has really been fully excavated. And while this doesn't do much for the modern-day visitor, it does suggest to the archaeologist an increase in attendance over time. The sporting area doesn't really change, but the scale of space for viewers increases dramatically. Now, there are two different myths that explain the origin of the Isthmian Games. The first myth suggests that the games are put on in honor of the god Poseidon because he saved the body of the young boy Melicertes. And the story goes that Melicertes' dad was driven mad by Hera, and that to escape him, his mom jumped off a cliff into the sea, with poor little Melicertes in her arms. But Zeus, feeling bad that Hera did this to them, turned them into sea divinities, and eventually a dolphin brought the body of Melicertes back to dry land near Isthmia. There, his uncle Sisyphus, the king of Corinth and the guy who eventually had to push that boulder eternally up a hill only to have it fall back down on him in Tartarus, he finds the body of Melicertes and founds the Isthmian Games as a set of funeral games to honor Melicertes and thank Poseidon for bringing him back to land. The other myth revolves around the Athenian hero Theseus. Before he ever defeated the Minotaur, he had to go on a dangerous journey to the Argolid and on his way to Athens. And along the way, he fought 6 guardians of the underworld. One of them, by the name of Sciron, lived near Isthmia. And when travelers came by, old Sciron would ask them to wash his nasty feet for him. And then when they bent over to do that, a very kind gesture, he would kick them off a cliff into the sea, where they would be devoured by a giant sea monster. Theseus, however, picked up old Sciron by his nasty-ass feet, swung him around, and chucked him into the sea himself, where he was devoured by that very same sea monster. And in honor of his victory, Theseus founded the Isthmian Games in honor of the god Poseidon. So, obviously both of these are mythological tall tales, but we do learn that the Isthmian Games were indeed dedicated to Poseidon, which makes sense given their location right next to the sea. And like the Pythian Games, the Isthmian Games share some of the Olympic characteristics, but then they kind of put their own twist on it. So for example, these games were held every 2 years rather than every 4 years. And the winner, just like the Olympic Games, got a wreath, but this one was made out of something different. In its earliest version, it was made out of celery, and then later on it was changed to pine, possibly to differentiate it from the Neme Games, which we'll hear about next. Anyway, the games themselves differ as well, and there was a much stronger emphasis at Isthmia on the equestrian events, so horse riding and chariot racing, and this makes sense when you consider that the games were dedicated to Poseidon, who in addition to being the god of the sea, was also the god of horses. Now last, and very honestly least, or at least when it comes to the overall prestige and importance of the games within Greek culture, we've got the Nemean Games. And these games were founded much, much later than the other three, and they were developed specifically to mimic the Olympic Games. So as whereas something like the Isthmian Games place a greater emphasis on equestrian sports because they're dedicated to Poseidon, the Nemean Games, they're really just kind of trying to be a mini Olympics. Now if you've heard of Nemea, it's likely in the context of Heracles. And as the first of his labors to purify himself from killing his family, Heracles had to defeat the Nemean lion, whose skin was impenetrable to the sword and arrow and anything else man-made. And with the games dedicated to Zeus, you'd think that the Nemean Games would be a dedication to Zeus in honor of Heracles successfully completing that labor against the Nemean lion. I'm not going to tell you how he does that. You'll have to take my classical mythology class to figure that out. But anyway, according to ancient sources, that's all wrong. The games actually arise, much like the Isthmian Games in the myth of Melicertes, as an offshoot of funeral games. Now, as the story goes, Queen Hypsipyle was carrying little baby Opheltes, the son of a priest of Zeus, and she encountered the 7 against Thebes, 7 heroes who were on a mission to restore the king of Thebes. Now, when they showed up, Hypsipyle put the baby Opheltes on the ground in a patch of wild celery so that she could get the 7 of Thebes, or the 7 against Thebes, some water. But while she was doing that, an evil serpent bit and killed poor baby Opheltes. And in the aftermath, the 7 hosted funeral games in honor of the poor baby Opheltes, and they dedicated those games to Zeus. And the winner, of course, got a wreath of dried celery based on where that poor baby Opheltes was placed in the grass. A tumulus, or a ritual burial mound, known as the Opheltion, sat at the center of Nemea, and spectators sitting on the mound could have viewed events in both the early version of the Stadion, where most of the events took place, and the early version of the Hippodrome, which took place a little bit later. Now, later around 300 BCE, the whole athletic infrastructure was reorganized, once again suggesting an increase in the importance of attendance at the games. And this complex was incredibly well preserved. So just like at Olympia, we can see the entrance tunnel, or the cryptae, and this time it was complemented by the apodicterion, or a locker room where athletes would have prepared for their events. And just like at Olympia, spectators would have sat on the grassy embankments to watch those events, and it could have held a similar number of people. Something around like 40,000 spectators could have fit in here. Now, one of the most gruesome depictions in all of ancient athletics comes from the site of Nemea, in a story that Pausanias tells about a boxing match between Kroigas and Demoxenos. And the match had gone on all day and it hadn't ended by the time it got dark. So what they decided to do was give each one of the people one punch, right? One free punch to see if they could knock him out. Now, I think the story itself and how it plays out is worth repeating in full here. Okay, now Kroigas aimed his punch at Demoxenos' head. Then Demoxenos told Kroigas to lift his arm, and Demoxenos struck him under the ribs with his fingers straight out. The combination of his sharp fingernails and the force of his blow drove his hand into Kroigas' guts. He grabbed Kroigas' intestines and he tore them out, and there Kroigas died on the spot. The Argives expelled Demoxenos on the grounds that he had broken his agreement by giving his opponents several blows instead of the agreed upon one. That is, one for each of his fingers, instead of the agreed upon one. They gave the victory to the dead Kroigas, and they erected a statue of him at Argos. Because of this incredibly well-preserved complex, right, a group of enthusiasts has actually restarted the Nemean Games and now holds them every year at the site. And let's just hope that those recreation games, they don't have boxing matches like that between Kroigas and Demoxenos. Whew, man, hope they aren't that gruesome. Now, so far, we've talked about the 4 Panhellenic Games, the Olympic Games, the Pythian Games, the Isthmian Games, and the Nemean Games. But sanctuaries all around the Greek world held their own set of smaller versions of games as well. Now, in our final section on antiquity today, let's turn our heads up to the sky and look up at the site of Mount Lycaon. All right, so both to learn about the games there, but also because this site is being excavated by us, the University of Arizona. So the site and sanctuary of Mount Lycaon is located in the western Peloponnese, not that far from the site of Olympia. It was dedicated to the god Zeus, Zeus Lycaos in fact, a version of Zeus recalling the myth of Lycaon, who ate human flesh and then turned into a werewolf for 7 long years. So Zeus Lycaos is actually kind of like werewolf Zeus. Now, on top of that mountain, there's a giant ash altar dating all the way back to the Bronze Age, suggesting it was in use long before the sanctuary at Olympia, which is a site relatively nearby. Now, Pliny the Elder, a Roman writer, states that the games at Mount Lycaon go back way further than the Olympics themselves, calling them the earliest in all of Greece. And that statement, combined with the archaeological evidence that dates to the Bronze Age, suggests this may have actually been a possibility. We could have had games here at Lycaon, the site that Arizona is excavating, long before we had games at Olympia. So perhaps the ash altar to Zeus at Olympia and the games themselves are all actually derived from their predecessors at Lycaon. You'll have to stay tuned to future U of A archaeological excavations to find out the true answer on that. All right, now one of the key takeaways from the Panhellenic Games in ancient Greece is their ties to religion. And in the case of Olympia and Delphi, we have religious sanctuaries that date back far earlier than the athletic competitions. And at Isthmia and Nemea, we have founding myths associating them with ritual funeral games. And when we look at most sports in the contemporary world, we seem to lose that kind of religious connection, right? So the NBA and the NFL and the MLB and the NHL, none of those are dedicated to a particular god, right? And even the Olympics has shed its connection to religion, marketing itself as a competition of nations rather than a ritual for Zeus. But while modern sports are explicitly tied to religion aren't explicitly tied to religion in the exact same way as the Panhellenic Games, there is a deep connection to religion nonetheless. So let's first look at the gridiron here, right? In American football, we can see religion intersect with sport in numerous ways. So players often proclaim their religious affiliation in the jewelry that they wear, right? A cross around the neck or something like that. A touchdown is often followed by an acknowledgement or a thanks to a higher power, kneeling, pointing upwards, things along those lines. And victory, especially in the Super Bowl, often gives the MVP a voice to highlight his religious beliefs, very frequently thanking God before anyone else. And in college, especially at institutions like Notre Dame, a Catholic school, or BYU, a Mormon school, religion plays a prominent role as well. If you're attending a Fighting Irish game, you only have to look over the north end zone to see that's right, touchdown Jesus, staring down at you from beyond the north end zone. And a priest leads the team in prayer before and after each of their games. Interestingly, this doesn't seem to clash with the idea that the team is known as the Fighting Irish and is then going to go try to physically dominate the other team for 60 minutes. Anyway, sometimes sports can even become a religion, at least metaphorically. Athletes train religiously, often building their own workouts around rigid, repeated routines. And fans, even more so, often treat sport like religion, praying for a last-second shot to go in, dressing for an event with the same sort of attention to detail that one might use when going to church, conducting superstitious rituals in order to influence events, and having their emotions rise and fall with the outcome of their team. A metaphor kind of for God in this analogy. So while sports and religion aren't tied in the same way that they were in Greek antiquity, the connection between these two phenomena certainly does still exist today. All right, you have made it to the end of another episode. Now, in today's lecture, we've looked at the world of the Panhellenic Games. And in doing so, we've discussed how these played a crucial role in the political and cultural ecology of ancient Greece. Now, because ancient Greek city-states were politically independent, the Panhellenic sanctuaries and the games that associated with them provided a space and place for a number of Greek city-states to come together and build cultural bonds in a competitive, but not deadly or militaristic, manner. We saw that the games at Delphi and at Isthmia and Nemea all shared similarities with the Olympics, their connection to religion, many of the events, the wreaths as prizes. But they also had their own twists on the games, whether it's specific events or infrastructure or timing. So next time you look at sport in the ancient Greek world, make sure to keep in mind that you're also looking at culture, at religion, at politics, and at the economy, all balled into one awesome event. Just a couple lessons you can learn from the Panhellenic Games.